Supervision, maybe my favorite topic in mental health, group and individual. I've done it now for 10 years, and I can honestly say I've probably learned more from supervision than any other part of the mental health process. So today we're going to talk about what it's like to be in both individual and group supervision. So stick around. Welcome to the dark side of therapy. If you're a new clinician, if you're a new graduate, and you want some guidance in terms of what to do with your career, avoid the pitfalls, and develop yourself into a wonderful therapist, this is the show for you. I have to tell you tonight I got a bit of a cold, so hopefully my voice is coming out somewhat intelligibly. I will do my best. This was sort of a requested episode where somebody had asked me, well, what really happens in group and individual supervision? And what we're referring to is you're a person that is on the licensure track. I talk a lot about this in my course. So you're not a licensed therapist yet, but you're on that path. Usually a 2 to 4 year process, so it takes some time. And you're kind of stuck with the supervisor you get unless something goes terribly wrong, which kind of brings me to a point of, if I had my way, I would have every supervisee in the world have to go through 4 different supervisors over the 4-year supervision process. That way, you could be introduced to so many different styles and ideologies and ways of doing things. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. But if you do individual and group supervision, you at least get to that way. And then I'll give you some balance too. You know, there I go again talking about the way I wish the world ran, but I don't run it, do I? I can only do my best to make it as good as it can be. So what is supervision exactly? Well, at its core, the number one thing we're trying to do is monitor cases of our supervisees. Now, when I say monitor cases, I mean, let's look at the cases that could be potentially bad, meaning cases where you could go to court, cases where there's possible domestic violence or violence against children. These are what we call high-risk cases. So in individual supervision and in group supervision, we're going to discuss both of these. But we really want to monitor these cases because, as George Harman says, cases that are vanilla have a way of becoming rocky road very quickly. So we're going to monitor your cases. We're going to talk about them to death because we want you to feel supported. We want you to know you have some direction. Now, the other thing we're going to do is we're going to do paperwork type things. And nobody likes documentation. I haven't met one person in this field that says, you know what, give me more documentation. But supervision is a great way to refine your documentation, especially in group, because as I found out, everybody does things just a bit differently. So in group supervision, we're going to share different strategies to do paperwork. Get it completed right, get it signed at the appropriate times, you know, when your supervisor signs it, when you sign it, and it can be a very effective discussion. Now in individual therapy or supervision, we'll do the same thing. It'll be a little more personal, but I like the group format because then we're all sharing ideas. And that's the other great thing about group supervision in general is we can share ideas that can't necessarily be shared between just the individual supervisee and the supervisor. We can share ideas, but it's just the two of us. I like the group format because anything goes. Now, every supervisor is going to do it differently, and some are boring as can be. Some supervisors, group and individual, are going to be very, very cold, very distanced, and really it's going to come down to a lot of pragmatic type things. You won't do a lot of reflection or deep processing. It's just trying to make sure we're not breaking any laws. One of my supervisors was like that. It was sort of a, let's scare you to the point that you don't even want to do the work anymore. I don't think that's very effective. I haven't met a supervisee that thinks that's effective. So you're going to get supervisors like that. And it's very difficult because then you get people that don't want to speak up. You know, God forbid you say something horribly wrong. We talked about this in supervision just the other day where a supervisee had gone to a training with a supervisor who I think the goal was to put the fear of God in them. And my question was, what happened to that supervisor to put them on this path of let's make people work in fear? Now, obviously, with the dark side, my goal is to point out things that aren't so great either. But my argument is I'm very hopeful at the end because I'm going to try to give you every skill and every ability that I possibly can to put you on the right path. So those kinds of supervisors are not real fun to interact with. But if you have a supervisor that's open and willing to be a little bit vulnerable, that goes a long way in group, and that's what I try to do. So you will sometimes get group supervisors and individual supervisors who allow themselves to be open, talk about their mistakes, and it leads to a much more conducive environment. Safety is huge. I never really thought about this coming up through the ranks, and I never felt unsafe in my supervision, but I certainly never felt safe enough to really admit my faults, all the things I had done wrong. And so my hope for you is you get a supervisor that will allow you to be that open. And sometimes in individual supervision, it's a little bit easier to be that way because you're not being judged by your peers. And yes, judgment happens. It's the same as if you're in a business meeting. It's the same if you're in any kind of social environment. Everyone's afraid of being judged. And it's a lot easier to just talk to one person than it is to talk in front of maybe 6 or 7. But unfortunately, that's a real pathway to growth. And if the environment is safe, you're going to find your supervisees willing to talk about their failures and what scares them. I never talked about what scared me in my supervision, and a lot of things did, from messing up a case to diagnosing incorrectly. I was scared a lot of the time, and I know my supervisees are scared a lot of the time. So these are the kinds of conversations that will happen, that can happen, that probably don't happen nearly enough. The other thing that happens is sometimes you'll get somebody that kind of dominates. This is in group supervision. And that can be tough because I'm one of these people that sometimes takes a more passive role because I believe what a person has to say in supervision is very important. But sometimes you will get that dominator that just will not shut up. And I sort of have to jump in and say, okay, any thoughts with that? Then you'll get the people that won't say anything, and I sort of have to nudge them too. And then you get the people that just feel like they are the expert, when in fact they're not. So all of these things are going to mix together. And again, different supervisors handle these things differently. I always go back to, and you can probably sense this from the videos you've watched, transparency. Transparency is an amazing tool. If I could give you all one tool this evening, it'd be transparency. Don't hide anything. Now, I'll be challenged on this right away from the supervisors who say, well, if you're too transparent, that's ethically inappropriate. And I'm not talking about letting my supervisees know where I live or my income, things like that. I'm talking about being transparent to the point that they look at me and they know I speak truth or my own truth. Because when that happens, I'm telling you, it opens up a whole new world. So if I could, again, give you the gift of transparency, I would do that. Now, what happens when it does go bad? And I've had it go bad. I've had individual supervision go bad. Excuse me, where at one point somebody said to me, and I think I talked about this in the course too, you look like you aren't satisfied with my response. You look like you want me to say something different. And I did. And this was probably 4 or 5 years ago, where I was halfway through my first 10 years of supervision, and I sort of had it in my head. I know exactly what I want you to say, and if you don't say that thing, you're essentially wrong. And to be called out on that was tough. And you get that feeling where the water, whoosh, goes over you. And I was kind of devastated that I'd become that person. But I thanked her after that because it really helped me wake up to, don't expect anything from your supervisees in terms of what you think they ought to be saying. Let them say what they're going to say. Because if I don't do it that way, then I'm really interfering with their transparency. Wake-up calls are tough. And wake-up calls are really tough when you're established. So for me to be an established therapist, established supervisor, it was tough to eat, but I did it. Now in group supervision, we had a situation a few years ago where a couple of people knew the same person in the group outside of the group. And guess what? There was some drama that started that came into the group. I'd never had that happen before. And I thought, wow, how are we going to handle this? So you ever been in those situations where everybody's sitting in the same room and everybody knows the problem, but nobody's talking about it? To further complicate it, it was a telehealth or a through the internet supervision meeting where I was in one place and all the other members were in another, which made it just that much more difficult. And so I took probably the biggest risk of my supervisory career, which is we're going to talk about this. And to say it was uncomfortable is the understatement of the year. But I was so happy that we got it out there, and I think the other supervisees were too. Those are the tough ones. Those are the tough ones. And unfortunately, you're going to be in groups where those issues don't get resolved. They just simply don't, either through leadership that's not there or people just aren't willing to address them. And when they don't, trust gets challenged and trust can be non-existent. So again, if I can give you a cue with that, it's talk about the things that nobody wants to talk about. Feelings get hurt sometimes. So what? Feelings get hurt. I hate to say this, but in this work and in the supervision that we do, feelings get hurt. Nobody wants to be challenged, and nobody wants to be told they're not doing a good job, and nobody wants to be told they're not communicating effectively. But if those things are all true, they have to be addressed if we're going to have good quality working relationships. The other really dark part of supervision that I experienced, and I talked about this in the course too, is I had a wonderful supervisee who had an additional supervisor in a different town. And she told me a story of how he basically said, you need to give me a hug before you leave the building, which is so unrelentingly unprofessional and scary and creepy. And it really brought my blood to a boil. You know, I said, how dare you? And I said to her, you need to report this guy immediately because this is not okay. And she did, and we got it taken care of. It just kind of blows me away that you always hear about in Hollywood, in the fashion industry, whatever, there are people that prey upon people. No, it happens in our field too, okay? And it's often very subtle. And unfortunately, it's very tough for me to give that person any good feedback after that because a supervisee is in a vulnerable position. I've often said in our episodes that the supervisee has very little power. Well, guess what? Here's where you do have power. If somebody makes an advance on you, you have all the right in the world to report them and probably destroy their career because that should not be happening. So can we talk about that, though, in group supervision? Again, if we trust each other, yes, we can. It's a great learning tool. It's an absolutely great learning tool. And let me turn this on its head. I've hugged supervisees. When they come up to me and give me a hug, I haven't said no. So maybe I'm eating my own words there, but I don't think so because I've never conditionally put on any supervisee when they should or should not hug me. So I think it's a very different thing. But again, these are things we need to talk about. A couple more things. I found that in supervision, both individual and group, it's tough to give people positive feedback. For whatever reason, I don't know if we get bred this way or the system does this to us, we don't necessarily like good feedback. And I will praise my supervisees up and down, and it's usually, thanks. I didn't really deserve that. And so that's something you will see in individual and group supervision too. It's tough to praise, and I kind of overkill because I think they're worth it. And I don't think I'll stop doing that because if you don't take some credit for what you're doing well, what's going to offset the bad days? What's going to offset the mistakes you make? So as you move into group and individual supervision, pay attention to the credit that the supervisor gives you or your peers. Pay attention to the credit you give your peers. I will do this really horrendous thing where I will have peer-to-peer compliment day where I just say, please compliment this person. And they do it, and the person complimenting has no problem giving the compliment. It's just the person receiving the compliment who has the tough time with it. Something else that may happen in your supervision, this might be uniquely me. About a year ago, we decided to do something really fun and have Jeopardy in our therapy sessions. And it sort of evolved from a lot of DSM stuff and symptom stuff, the historical leaders in the mental health field, to I developed a category called rock and roll. I love rock and roll music. And my idea was I would play a clip of a rock and roll song, Bruce Springsteen, Queen, whatever. And the clip didn't go through for whatever reason. And either it didn't go through or they lied to me because one of the members said, Eric, you can go and sing the song. I thought, wow. And it became something that is now a staple of our supervision. Every 6 weeks we do Jeopardy. We have a rock and roll category. I sing every clip. And it has made a tremendous impact on people Because remember what I said about transparency and vulnerability a few minutes ago? That's my way of being vulnerable. And somebody said, you know, this is like the best Monday of my week. And I really appreciate that. Because if I can be goofy and fun and do things that probably don't happen in a lot of supervision, that's what makes me happy. Really freeing it up for folks. So these are all things that happen in group and individual supervision. And as you move into it again, recognize there's a lot to learn. And there's a lot of styles out there. Some you're going to be compatible with, some that you're not. And my hope for you is that at some point you get a really, really, really wonderful supervisor. Because again, odds are you're probably going to get two unless you just do individual. And if you don't get a supervisor that's great, you can learn from that too. And do not be afraid to provide suggestions. Let me say that again. Do not be afraid to provide suggestions. Some supervisors won't hear it, and that'll be the end of it. But some will. And I think that all goes back to how you approach it too. But in a sense, they're working for you. They are there to make you better at what you do. I have gotten to a point at my age where I am fine with feedback because it makes me better at what I do. The ego is gone. Again, you may not have the same experience, but it is okay to say to your supervisor, here's something I think would help. So don't be afraid to do that. I want to say thank you for joining me this evening. If you liked this video, please hit like, and as always, subscribe. And we will see you next time for a new episode of The Dark Side of Therapy. Thank you.